Good morning, colleagues. It's great to be here with you today. In this first panel, we will provide you with an overview of what NEETs are and what they need, some policy needs and options, and some best practices to integrate NEETs into the labor market and education. And I have the privilege to have two excellent speakers with me today. I'm very happy that they're here with us. On my right hand, I have Ms. Karen Maguire. She works for the OECD as a head of division of local employment skills and social innovation. And this program is called LEAD, and it's in the Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, regions and cities. And Karen has worked for already 18 years for the OECD, so a vast experience. And this LEAD program, it provides data, policy analysis, and capacity building to both national and subnational governments in the areas of local economic development, local actions for employment and skills, social inclusion, the social economy and culture, and then still among other topics. So that's quite a broad range of fields. And on my far right, I have Dr. Niall, and he's a senior economist in the ILO Analysis Unit, and he's a professor of economics at the University of Salerno. Niall holds degrees from York and Sheffield University.
York y un doctorado.
Interests cover various aspects of labor and experimental economics. And previously as a senior researcher in the ILO's youth employment of the ILO's biennial global employment trends for youth. He has written books on internships and youth employment policy, and he's also the author of two recent papers on volunteering as a school-to-work transition mechanism and on the design of volunteer programs to facilitate the entry and re-entry of young people into work. So we will have two presentations today, and I would also require some action from you. I'm hoping to get some questions from the room after the presentations. So if there's anything that you find particularly interesting, or if there's a topic you want to raise, please feel free after the presentations to raise your question. And then I would like to invite Niall to take a stand at the speaker's chair to have the first presentation for us, which is on the varieties of NEET, the characteristics, determinants, and implications for policy. Thank you, Niall.
Thanks, Niels. One in four young people in the world today are neither in employment, education, or training. That's nearly 300 million young people, 290 million young people, two-thirds of which, nearly 200 million, are young women. That's a problem. Good morning, distinguished delegates, colleagues. I'm honored to be here to talk to you a little bit about some of the general trends and issues surrounding NEETs in the world today. I'm going to start with a few words on the concept of NEET, young people not in employment, education or training. This is not always fully understood, this concept, and I think it's important to say something about some key trends and characteristics, and in particular to point out how different it is from youth unemployment, the more traditional indicator that we use to measure health of youth labour markets. I'll then say something in general terms about implications for policy. Then I think Karen is going to get more into the nitty-gritty and talk about some more specific approaches. Okay, so who are the NEETs? Well, in the first place, the NEET rate, the share of young people who are not in employment, education or training, is SDG indicator 8.6.1. That is, it is the indicator that we use to measure progress towards decent work in youth labour markets at an international level. that is reducing the NEET rate. It was established as a target, one of the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015. Broadly speaking, one can think of NEET as comprising two broad groups of young people. In the first place, young people who are unemployed, so the traditional subject of public employment service intervention. But young NEETs also include a much larger group, particularly in lower middle income countries, of young people who are outside the labour force as traditionally defined and are also not in education. And this is perhaps the more challenging group to deal with in policy terms. If we look at the traditional way of dividing up the youth population into the labour force and the outside the labour force on the right-hand side in the figure, we'll see that unemployed comprise 69 million young people. Nearly 70 million young people are unemployed. But if we look to the left, we can see that nearly 4 times that amount, almost 290 million young people are NEET. So the size of the problem is about 4 times as large when we start talking about NEET as opposed to youth employment. Looking at it in another way, traditionally we tended to see the youth employment problem as one of the labour force, concerning the labour force. In the figures here, we see that on the left-hand side, we have the more traditional approach, the unemployment rate, which is the share of the unemployed as a share of the labour force, that is the unemployed plus the employed. And we can see that that is 14% in the world today. But that comprises only a little over 5% of all young people. If we look to the right, and consider NEET, that means adding that light green bit, the inactive so-called young people, and that brings us to almost 1 in 4, 23.5% of the youth population are NEET today. One of the things that happens when one starts to expand one's focus is one needs to recognize that NEETs are extremely heterogeneous. They're very varied. The reasons for being NEET are many and various. So immediately the issue arises, how do we categorize them? One approach suggested by Eurofound, and which is generally applied to date, is we first divide the NEETs into whether they're in the labour force or not. And so we have on the one side the unemployed, which can be further subdivided into other categories. But more importantly, we then have those outside the labour force. And here there is really a lot of reasons why young people are not actively searching for work, even though they don't have work and they're not studying. This comprises young people who are discouraged, that is, they would like to work, but they stop looking because they feel there are no opportunities available. There is also a large group, in fact, the largest group, particularly in lower middle-income countries, of young people with family responsibilities, and this is primarily young women, who are not looking for work and not seeking to work because of care responsibilities that they have. Then there's a group of young people with disabilities, which face a different set of obstacles to participating in the labour force, and then there's a residual other category. Anyway, the main point is that there is a great variety in the reasons for being NEET, and these need to be taken into account when we start to design effective policy remedies. So looking at some of the characteristics, this map shows NEET rates around the globe at the national level. The darker colours correspond to higher NEET rates, and we can see that, I don't know how obvious it is, but NEET rates are higher in lower and lower middle income countries. We can see that they tend to be high in the African continent as a whole, also in Southern Asia, and this is an important issue moving forward. In fact, NEET rates vary widely. They're from under 5% to over 50% in the world today. And this relationship between country income and NEET rate is generally true across the world. There's a great deal of variety across countries, but generally speaking, there's an inverse relationship between country income and the NEET rate, the share of young people who are not in employment and training. It is particularly pronounced for young women, but it is there for both young men and young women. So generally speaking, NEET rates tend to increase with economic development and with the development of country income, although there is a great deal of variation around that trend. And we see that NEET rates are almost invariably higher amongst young women than men. In this map, we show the ratio of female NEET rates to male NEET rates. And we can see that the darker colors correspond to higher ratios, so more young women to young men, respectively. And again, we see that the highest ratio, the highest distance, if you like, between young women and young men, one finds in Northern Africa, Southern Asia, and the Middle East. Important to recognize is not just a numerical difference. The underlying factors which drive NEET rates are somewhat different for young men and young women. Of course, this is a gross generalization, but generally speaking, differences in male NEET rates are typically driven by the lack of availability of job opportunities. So NEET is mainly about unemployment, or is in any case labour market related. Amongst females, amongst young women, NEET rates also have a lot to do with structural barriers to entering education and or the labour market. And young female NEETs are mostly engaged in, mostly so-called inactive. They're not actively looking for work. NEET rates are typically higher and the gender gap wider in rural areas as opposed to urban areas, and this is particularly true, in lower middle income countries. And this is quite different to what we see if we look at, this is quite different from the impression that we would get looking at youth unemployment rates. And that's an important difference, I think, to focus on. Similarly, NEET status is concentrated amongst the least educated. So NEET rates tend to fall as individual education attainment rises. This is particularly true in high-income countries, but it's true also across the board. The difference in low-income countries to high-income countries is rather marked, and if one is tertiary educated in a low-income country, one still has a 1 in 5 chance, about 20% of young people in low-income countries with tertiary education are NEET. So clearly education is not the full solution to the problem, but the relationship exists between getting more education does help. We've seen recently, of course, we're coming out now somewhat from the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. What we saw before that is that, at least in high-income countries in particular, and to some extent in middle-income countries, NEET rates were gradually falling to 2019. We also saw that in high-income and middle-income countries, following the COVID-19 pandemic, NEET rates have largely, by 2022, NEET rates had largely got back to their pre-COVID levels. This is not the case in low and lower middle-income countries. NEET rates in these in low and lower middle-income countries are both higher, they've been increasing over time, and in low-income countries they're continuing to increase despite the recovery in other parts of the world. So this is a major issue of concern. Of course, high NEET rates is not the only concern facing young people, particularly in low-income countries. Informal employment, for example, is a serious issue, but NEET certainly is a problem that needs to be faced. And one reason why it needs to be faced is that NEET rates are persistent. This is a little awkward to understand this figure, but this is basically, this figure separately for young men and young women, plots NEET rates of 15 to 24-year-olds against the NEET rates of 25 to 34-year-olds 10 years later. So this shows the relationship between what happens in one cohort as it gets older. So if you're NEET today, you're much more likely to be NEET tomorrow. So one of the reasons why it's important to intervene and intervene early is because there is persistence. You're NEET today, you're more likely to be NEET tomorrow. There is scarring, if you like. This will condition your future labour market chances over the long term, and this is really why it's so important to intervene when young people, before they become long-term NEETs. So to summarise, NEET rates are nearly everywhere higher amongst young women than young men. NEET rates also tend to fall as country income increases, although there is a lot of variation. NEET rates are higher and the gender gap's larger in rural compared to urban areas, and NEET rates tend to fall with rising individual education attainment. All of these factors are quite different to what one sees if one examines youth unemployment, and this is important to make clear. There's also strong evidence of persistence or scarring, especially amongst young women, and that emphasises the need to act on young people, to support young people in their search on their affecting the transition from school to work. Finally, rather worryingly, as we come out of the COVID-19 induced economic slump, we see that even so, that things are getting better, broadly speaking, in the world. Low-income countries' NEETs continue to rise. So, what are the implications for policy? Well, I mentioned there are many more young NEETs than unemployed. And just as important, NEETs have quite different characteristics to the young unemployed. So, NEETs comprise also the unemployed, but they're a relatively small group at a global level, 1 in 4, about less than 1 in 4. NEET rates are ubiquitously or everywhere higher for young women. And more generally, we see that NEET rates are higher amongst more vulnerable groups, in contrast to youth unemployment. NEET rates can be reduced by increasing youth employment, but also by encouraging a return to education. Clearly, there's two ways this occurs. One, by arithmetically, if we increase the numbers of young people participating in education, numerically we're going to reduce the NEET rate. But there is a more longer-term effect, of course, that by raising young people's competences and skills, they're going to have better prospects in the future. There clearly needs to be a greater policy focus on removing obstacles to the entry to education and to employment of vulnerable groups. So, yeah, reducing NEET is about not just about finding jobs for young people who are looking for them, but more generally reducing those obstacles which prevent young people participating in the first place in the labour market. Outreach, clearly, in this context is a very important issue. One needs to reach out, form partnerships, and find those young, inactive NEETs who would work if they could, but have given up looking due to the lack of adequate opportunities or face barriers to their participation in the labour force. Generally, this suggests that facing the NEET challenge requires a broad-based approach. Young NEETs often face multiple simultaneous barriers to employment, education and training, and so the array of interventions must have, in the foremost, it must have macroeconomic and sectoral development policies at its heart. Young people need more jobs. We have to create more employment opportunities for young people. For anything, all the other support that is provided to have any effect. Of course, then there are the more traditional active labour market programs and job search support for young people that public employment services traditionally deal with. But as I said, we need to think more in terms of what other barriers young people are facing in accessing decent work. And these will vary, of course, very much by local circumstances. interventions, we know quite a lot about what works, particularly as regards active labour market program, active labour market interventions. We know that combining supported employment and training tends to work better than either of these in isolation. We know that interventions work better if they're tailored to meet the specific characteristics and determinants of the young people they're aimed to help. And so clearly this also applies to young NEETs. For example, attention needs to be paid to the various obstacles to educational and labour force participation that young women face in differing national contexts. Support, for example, to facilitating access to childcare facilities is one example of a type of approach here. We have, in the European Union, there's a good example of such a comprehensive, broad-based approach, the European Youth Guarantee. This has been in place since 2014, and it has been accompanied by a gradual but significant decline in youth NEET rates. Although I have to add that that is mostly about reductions in youth unemployment in the EU. Certainly, this provides an encouraging example, in particular this notion that it's based on the guarantee, so that young people receive an offer before they become long-term NEETs. They get an offer of employment, education, and training. Establishing such a comprehensive framework is challenging, of course, both institutionally and financially. It's proved to be so in the European Union, or also outside. A number of countries in Central and Eastern Europe, for example, are adopting this guarantee approach, and in North Africa too. It is costly, but perhaps one can think about different elements of the approach, in particular this idea of offering support to all NEETs before they become established in their NEEThood, if you like. And of course, in thinking about how costly it is to intervene, one also has to bear in mind the costs of not doing so. If we don't act now, these young NEETs are going to become permanently excluded from the labour market. That is the danger, and that is the main concern. And I think I'll end there. There are a few in the presentation, a few relevant publications which may be interested. And with that, I thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Niall. Well, there's plenty to do for you when you're traveling back to your countries, since you provide us with so much more information. And thank you for your excellent and very interesting presentation, and restating how important this topic is for our labour markets, but also for the NEETs themselves, of course. Karen, may I hand over to you, please? Thank you.
Great. Well, good morning, and a huge thanks to our very gracious hosts for receiving us here today. And I'm very pleased to be joining you. As Niall had said, I come from a part of the OECD that really focuses on this local lens. And I think it's a nice kickoff from after Niall's presentation, because if we want to think about how to solve the problem, we need to think about all the different factors that are getting people in a situation where they fall into this NEET category. So I just wanted to highlight a few trends, talk about some special policy considerations, and then some things to think about for the future as we think about different mega trends. So we just saw some of the rates across different parts of the world, and this is from the universe of OECD, where you can see some slight declines in rates over time. But you see, of course, very different scenarios depending on which part of the age categories we're talking about, whether it's the 15 to 19-year-olds versus the 20, 24-year-olds. So you can really see, quite a difference there in those rates. What I wanted to really highlight here is just that it's not the same across a territory within any given country. So here are just some examples, and it is not an eye test, so you don't need to read all of the numbers, but just to illustrate that within any given country, that rate could be in one region 10% and in another region 46%. So that this place lens really is shown to be important if you look at the data in different countries across the different regions. If you think about some of the things that Niall just mentioned about the quality of the labor market. So this is really just to highlight that you can, one diagnostic that might be particularly interesting is to understand, is one of the biggest challenges my local labor market, or is it that actually others in my country might have a similar unemployment rate, but I have a higher NEET rate? So what do I need to do differently in my local area? What are the different drivers? So I think what I just wanted to point out with this slide is just that there can be very different circumstances to look into, and some a public employment service can address, and some it's really a lot of other actors that have to step in to help. Was mentioned the challenges in particular in rural areas, and we see this as well in some of our countries in the EU and the OECD. And we also see very different rates when we look at departure from education and training. And again, this is an area where this local lens can be particularly important. And of course, different branches of public employment services are going to know a little bit more about what are the special circumstances in the regions that they're operating that are perhaps contributing to this early departure, which then of course has major implications later on down the line. Another issue I wanted to raise for the discussions was just on the mismatch between educational qualifications and what people are actually using in their jobs. And you can see that on average, we have in the OECD around 18% that are underqualified for the job that they have, and 17% that are overqualified. And in some contexts and places, those ratios are a bit different. But I think it points to some considerations about what is the sort of career guidance and what are the types of jobs that are available, and this challenge in matching. And we already see that for those who are in jobs, there's a bit of a mismatch. So the challenge for those who aren't able to gain employment is even stronger. We heard a little bit about, in the opening remarks, also youth entrepreneurship and opportunities for self-employment. Youth have much lower rates of self-employment than adults. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes youth need perhaps to have the practice of going to work every day, etc. But when there are opportunities, youth tend to struggle in the creation of their businesses because they have fewer networks, less access to capital, etc. So this work on youth entrepreneurship, the OECD has a lot of work on what we call missing entrepreneurs that might be of interest to you as you're thinking about policies to support youth entrepreneurship. So in terms of some policy perspectives, I think what is important to really highlight, of course, is that there's all sorts of places along the way where something might not work. And, you know, in the public employment services, you're dealing with something that has started many, many years ago. And so I think the main message I wanted to communicate here was, how is it that in the different systems, young people are able to get back up on a ladder if for some reason they drop out or they're not visible on the sort of timeline, if you will, from education into the labor market. And so the different practical examples that hopefully we'll learn about here over the next 2 days, which I'm looking forward to hearing about, to take back good examples for OECD reports on the different phases that people have contributed along this chain from starting early in education into actual labor market integration. So one thing I really wanted to highlight as well is just that a lot of the different barriers and issues that have been raised and also in the opening remarks are covered by many different ministries. So there's a big challenge on what we would call the horizontal integration, but also across levels of governments. And I think what's important to highlight here is just that often social support on social services is often done a bit more locally than employment services, which tends to be in many countries at a slightly higher level. And so the ability to kind of work together will depend in part on the different structures in countries on these different integration mechanisms. So a few examples, and we'll hear, I think, throughout the next 2 days, many more, but just to give one that the OECD has found particularly interesting, and some of these examples will be featured in a toolkit by the OECD following a recommendation on youth that was issued a little over like 2 years ago following COVID, where really there was a lot of public attention to the needs of youth. So this example of a one-stop shop in Finland was really very interesting because it was public employment services and municipalities and other kinds of local partnerships, but also you didn't need an appointment. Youth could come at any time. And I think this accessibility and flexibility is something that was particularly interesting in this example. We heard about the youth guarantees, and I just wanted to say that one that the OECD has deemed one particularly interesting, the contrat d'engagement jeune, and we heard from our colleagues at France Travail that there will be some changes, but just to highlight that this is a program that has been very interesting from the OECD perspective, and we look forward to hearing more about it in other sessions. Another area that has come up, especially supporting NEETs, is youth-led social enterprises. As was said earlier, there are some sort of different aspirations of younger generations, and many of them are looking to make a difference. Now, this is not the case perhaps of every single individual who is not in employment, education, or training, but it is an opportunity to engage people. In this Up to Youth project, a multi-country project, we have highlighted because it has a lot of policy support for social entrepreneurship in terms of the skills, the funding, and also the legislation in order to make these social enterprises registered formal entities. We see around the world also different projects for rural contexts as well. It's not just about cities. And what's interesting about this example from Colombia is that they're really orienting young people towards the rural occupations that their that their public employment service has identified, and then working through the National Training Service to help them, for example, green agriculture. I also wanted to highlight, because many of the countries present have an informal economy that is a significant share of their employment, and just to highlight that the role of the social economy as a way to help some of these activities that maybe they're conducting but informally, or to bring them into some form of collective entrepreneurship, that a lot of work and interest is in the role of cooperatives and other other types of social economy structures. They might be in your countries a nonprofit, a social enterprise, an association, a mutual society, but that these are new forms of support that can be given to helping with job creation, especially for those coming from a disadvantaged background. There's also, of course, the wage subsidies, and I just caution that sometimes evaluations vary in terms of the effectiveness in different places, but there are some that have some strong impact evaluations, like this program in Chile, that if you're interested, we can get you more information about. And then I think also this pathway back into education and the role that public employment services can play in helping to get people to re-enter, and how that can link with the employment system. And Brussels Capital Region has, for example, programs to reimburse tuition and transport for those who are able to go back into training and education. And, you know, of course, there's a little bit of a look at what kinds of education and training, but the idea being it's another pathway back on to the training track. So I think, you know, going ahead, I wanted to flag some of the mega trends that will also be affecting labor markets. Now, we heard earlier in the intro about artificial intelligence and some of these other ways of changing the world of work changing. When you look at the graph on your right, you know, if you look at just digital skills overall and the vast number of jobs that are requiring this is huge. Now, the nature of AI, the exposure is still not clear what jobs will be augmented and what jobs will be replaced. But it, of course, is going to have a much wider impact than the traditional automation that we've seen in more industrial type jobs. And then when we talk about the green transition, which is a huge imperative for everybody, I should say we have a report that highlights that actually over the last decade, those green jobs tended to go more to capital cities, almost 3/4 to men, and to those with higher skills. So we have to be attentive as the green transition accelerates to what this will mean for young people and where there are opportunities. And in particular, this means choices made in the education system much further down on the line when they're much younger, when they're in, you know, the end of primary or middle school, for example. So another big trend, of course, and this is a little bit different depending on the country context, is demography. And of course, in places where in Europe, it's labor shortages. That's the big concern, and everyone's looking for people to work to fill the jobs. And so here, that's the trying to get these youth into jobs means that those who aren't already in jobs, there's likely even more barriers than before. Now, in other countries, there's a huge demographic boom for youth, and that's going to be a very different scenario in terms of the opportunities that are available to them. And that's where I think a lot of this sort of necessity self-employment or job creation through entrepreneurship is even more critical. We heard about different aspirations, and the joke was when we were preparing this session, every generation thinks that the one before didn't work as hard, or that they've done more, and the next generation isn't quite as dedicated. But it's really a different set of values, and so this is just one illustration using some Gallup data, but just to show the difference in what millennials and older generations are looking at in terms of the characteristics of their jobs. And this is a very particular sample. This is for the United States. But just to understand what that means, as Mr. Ben Khalil had said at the beginning, for thinking about what we need to do. And then this issue of aspirations. What do people aspire to do? How are those aspirations formed? A lot of it is related to peer groups, Increasingly, we have to think about social media, both social media for reaching NEETs, but also the influence it has on what they think about their professional opportunities. If, a large share want to become sports stars, well, not everyone's going to become a sports star, for example. But I think the issue here is to think also about how to match these aspirations with labor market information that changes rather quickly, and often people are influenced, youth are influenced also by their parents on the tracks that they're taking throughout their education pathway. And so we also have to think about the peers and the parents as we think about informing them on their pathways to where would likely be employment that they would find fulfilling. And I just also wanted to flag mental health considerations, because this has really come to the fore in a lot of different debates and discussions. And one of the driving factors, along with other family considerations that might contribute to an individual falling off different pathways. And so here's just one example from Australia called Headspace, where there's really a strong emphasis on addressing some of these social considerations that are then a factor that are behind exclusion. So I'll just conclude here and look forward to any questions, and don't hesitate to come up in English or in French, and I'll be pleased to speak with you throughout the conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. And actually, questions in Turkish and Spanish will also be welcomed, as we have the interpretation with this. So to start you off, since we have some time now, I will start you off with a question for both of you, and then I will look to the colleagues in the room to provide us with more questions. So my first question is for you, Niall, if I may. You have told us that NEETs are a very heterogeneous group, and as a policymaker, how should we take this heterogeneity into account when we are designing new policies?
Well, indeed, I mean, the key thing here is to precisely tailor interventions and have a range of interventions available for, according to the different situations that young people find themselves in. There's a lot of, and there are a number of programs that do this. In Korea, they have a program for young people which has different, sort of is focused amongst teenagers on maintaining attachment to the education, and then as we go up the age group, then it shifts into more support to gaining employment. And so it's basically, and the evaluation literature supports this idea that it's very so important to tailor interventions, to have multiple options in order to better support young people in their search for work.
Thank you very much, Niall. And Karen, I wanted to ask you, you spoke a little bit about the social economy and social companies. How can we as a PES better collaborate with these social economy to reach needs and to help them re-enter the labor market?
Great, thank you. And this issue of the social economy will also be featured in the next sort of World Association of Public Employment Services report as well that we're contributing to. On the social economy, we heard, for example, about the coach du quartier, or the local actors, the people that know what is going on in their communities and that know the special considerations for different groups, whether it's somebody who's coming from a migration background, whether it's somebody who's coming from a household where people haven't been working even at their parent age. And the social economy, and what I mean here are the nonprofits, the social enterprises. They have different forms, legal forms in different countries, but they tend to know what it is that is special about the population group that is struggling, and they tend to have some form of trust. We heard earlier, I think in the beginning, about sometimes youth having maybe some distrust of public institutions. And so this can be a very helpful pathway. I think some of the challenges for PES in working with social economy economy actors, and some already, of course, are actively doing so. And the challenges are with often procurement rules, the size of the contracts, some of the other regulations associated with the qualifications of the people working in these entities. You know, if I'm trying to reach out to a particular person, I want the one who's going to be most effective, not necessarily the one who's got the highest level of education leading the nonprofit. So I think there are other issues associated with, you know, the scale, and then the sort of ebb and flow of public contracts, which can have a very disproportionate impact on some of these social economy actors that don't have as many alternative sources of financing to keep up their staff and activities. But I think it's a great opportunity to reach out to those who are not already on the registers, because a lot of this, you know, for somebody in a PES to reach out, they need to know they exist. And how do they know they exist if they're not registered? And so I think this is another vehicle that can support, along with all this service integration, for identifying folks that might be able to benefit from the PES programs.
Thank you. So would you then plead for more long-term cooperations with these social enterprises?
I mean, I think you have to be conscious of different procurement rules in different countries, so I don't want to speak out of turn on regulations, but it's true that partnerships also with learning, because one thing is the PES can also be learning about what was particularly effective from the social economy actor that might have a bit more flexibility in the way that they work and in the tools that they use, and it could be beneficial also for mutual learning, for perhaps integration then into mainstream policy delivery by the PES itself.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, colleagues, it's really up to you. I hope that some of you have some questions for our panelists. I look in the room for a question, please. Sandrine, thank you. Yeah, there's a mic coming for you, Sandrine. Thank you.
Okay, merci. Je pose la question.
Thank you. I will be asking my question in French. My question, in fact, for Mr. O'Higgins, or maybe for both of the speakers. You talked about the needs, and especially in rural parts of regions. Do you have any examples that you can give us? Of course, it is a topic, it's a central topic, yes, in order to create positive solutions, especially for disadvantaged people, but I think it should also be decentralized in order to have a re-dynamization of rural parts. So maybe it would be a good idea to share some examples, or maybe give a few references so that we can know more about the needs in rural parts, just like I said.
Thank you very much. I don't know whether possibly Karen will have something to say about this as well. But there are a number of examples. Yes, NEET rates are much higher in rural areas, so there have been a number of initiatives. Maybe here it's an area where digitalization and internet-based jobs can also play a role. There's an example from India of a program which organized rural women and in meeting recruiters from internet companies to organize online work. And we find in general that crowd work is particularly desired, let's say, by young women, also because of the flexibility that it gives in terms of care responsibilities. The issue there is that actually crowd work being a sort of piece rate type thing, the earnings of young women tend to be lower, but that is a supply-driven phenomenon. So the wages they earn, the earnings they get are lower, but that's because more young women want to do it, and precisely because of the flexibility that it offers.
Yes, please.
I mean, I think for rural areas, one thing to particularly consider is just first the quality of the local labor market and what jobs are available. The big challenge in rural development is keeping youth in that area. Well, what keeps them in that area is that they actually can go to education close by, because what happens is they move for education and then they're much less likely to move back. Another issue is, so there's the sort of location of opportunities for education and employment. There's also a question of what are the ways that other services are oriented. If you have to take a bus 40 minutes to get to your high school, because in rural areas they're sort of, have to get critical mass, you have to group across a larger geography. Well, that might be a bigger barrier than a NEET in a city, where the issue is not at all transport, but some other family circumstance or social influence.
Thank you, Karen. Please, in front for the chair of the PES, and then after that from Uruguay. Thank you.
Merci. Tout d'abord, je voudrais remercier les panélistes pour leurs interventions.
I would like to thank these interventions. I would like to ask something to the International Organization of Employment, and I want to speak a bit about the southern countries. The first thing I want to ask is, do you count among the needs also people looking for unemployment? The definitions may change according to the countries. Sometimes only marginalized people are considered, and these people have excluded themselves from society and from all structures and organizations, state organizations. This is the first question, but this should be normalized. And two other questions concern the rural environment. Often there is another phenomenon. In Morocco, we don't have NEETs, and I was surprised to see that there are more NEETs in the rural area than in the urban environment. But everybody is busy doing something. People are working, but it is a work which is not remunerated, and which was really 20%. Now there is a decrease, but it's another phenomenon I would like to speak about. For the social economy, generally speaking, of course, there are a lot of approaches, as it has been said, but maybe there is one point in which people are without any success. These are services to the person, to the family, and to the community. This is a very important employment niche. So I'm talking about before school time, kindergarten, people who are not autonomous, when you have to help them, restoration of monuments, sports, culture. These are very expensive things, but it is a very big employment niche. So among the Occidental countries and other countries, there is a big difference between this employment and employment given by associations. In the States, 30% of employment is created by associations or foundations, and then these people work for them. And when we speak about social employment, I'm talking about cooperatives. So all these products, organization of women in structures which are benefiting from some tax exonerations or something like that, especially when we speak about marketing and so forth. These were my contributions and my comments. Thank you.
So much, Niall, to reflect on this.
Yes, so two definitional questions. Well, yes, and in fact, this was one reason I tried to emphasize regarding the first question, the inclusion of the young unemployed. Unemployed young people, so long as they're not actually also participating in education, because it's possible to be unemployed but participating in education. But all young people who are not in employment or education or training are included amongst the NEETs. So that is, and that's clear on at the international level. It's not widely understood, I think, or it's not widely, and national definitions may vary, but this is the approach that we apply when producing international comparable statistics, and it's what we mean, what we think about when we're talking about how to deal with NEET conceptually. So that's very clear. NEETs include the unemployed. It's not. In fact, NEET has become, in Spanish, nini, and so on. There's a pejorative term that actually it includes all job seekers are non. It's all young people who are not in employment and not studying. Okay. Secondly, the issue, yes, in 2013, the International Conference of Labour Statisticians modified the traditional concept of employment so that now employment is only work which is done for pay or profit. So a distinction was made between employment on the one hand and work on the other. Work includes employment, but it also includes unpaid work of various types. So it's possible to be NEET while you're actually working, providing unpaid care services, for example, volunteering, a whole range of, yes, the distinction is made between work for pay or profit and work which is not for pay or profit. And that is now, it takes time for these definitions to actually be applied, but since 2013 this was established at the international level, and nowadays countries are more and more implementing this. So yes, there are some, quite a significant numbers, particularly young women doing unpaid care work in the family or outside, who are also NEET. So it's not, young NEETs are not necessarily not working, but they are by definition not employed.
Thank you. Karen, maybe on the last part of the question?
Well, I think, it's true in different countries. A lot of that non-remunerated work may be in agriculture and in other activities. What I think maybe in the comments that you mentioned, I just highlight that we completely agree that the social economy is both a source of employment for people and a source of support for their integration into other employers. So I think it's a very important point to highlight. And in some countries, in Europe, for example, it might be up to 10% of employment is actually in the social and solidarity economy. And then depending on how different countries, how you count cooperatives, etc., those could be different figures, but it's true that they have this dual role as direct employers and as facilitators of improving outcomes in the labor market.
Thank you. Thank you. So I believe the microphone is in Africa now. And then after that, I would like to get it to Uruguay, who already raised his hand. So please, if you could have a precise question, because we have quite a few of other people who also want to ask a question. Please go ahead.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Moderateur.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I would like to congratulate both speakers for everything which has been said so clearly. I'm coming from Mali, National Agency for Employment in Mali. And I would like to know the following. Of course, the chairman of WEBS answered in a way to my question, but the notion of unemployment unemployment and the notion of needs. What is the big difference? Because I am coming from a country that, contrary to what Mr. Ogden has said, unemployment is a new phenomenon. In our community, there was no unemployment. So everything which wasn't school and employment had something to do. So should we put them in this framework in our target group? And what is the share of the informal sector in the employment of this group? This was a question I would like to get an answer.
Okay. Yes, unemployed. Yes, in fact, this is one of the issues, particularly in Africa as a whole. There's actually a positive relationship between the youth unemployment rate and the unemployment rate in general, and country income, which makes no sense if one's thinking about unemployment as an indicator of labour market problems. And in fact, no, unemployed, but young NEETs include the unemployed, but it's a much broader group. And in one of the reasons for adopting it is precisely to get a better indicator of youth labour market problems. I mean, unemployment is very much a high-income country concept. It was developed as such, and its relevance in lower middle-income countries is at best questionable. Certainly, my personal point of view is that the NEET rate is it's good to have both, but the NEET is a more comprehensive indicator which gives a better indication of the issues. And it's also much simpler to apply because for the International Labour Organization, the unemployment rate, to be unemployed, I need to be actively seeking work. And, you know, if there's no employment office nearby or employment works through informal relations, it's not clear what actively I have to do to get a job. So what actual sense this makes in many contexts can vary. So yes, I agree. So NEET is a more general concept, but includes the unemployed.
Thank you very much, Niall. Then I walk to Uruguay, who was already waiting for a little bit for us.
Buenos días. Good morning, everybody. Exactly, I'm the representative of Uruguay, and my question is related to the question of our colleague from Mali, and I'm especially going to focus on rural areas. Whenever we speak about the difficulties, especially for women to join the working world, and you were talking about the non-remunerated work and that related to their house. I would like to know if in the rural areas we have quantified what's the percentage of non-remunerated work. It's very traditional in small companies for the members of the youth to be part of the company, but it's not a remunerated and non-paid job, so it's obviously not part of the definition that we have for NEETs. Obviously, they are working, and this difference is important because although they could be part of the same group, from the conceptual point of view, there is a difference between saying I'm neither working nor studying, but I am doing an unpaid job in a rural area. That's the main difference. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Yes, this is again for you, Niall. Thank you.
I'm afraid I don't know offhand the share of young NEETs who are also working but not in employment, but it is an important point, and it precisely gets to the heart of some of what I was saying, in that it's really important to prepare interventions to suit circumstances and suit the very different circumstances. So it's important to, and in principle, one can calculate this. Unpaid care work, for example, or unpaid work more generally can be an important source, source of activity for young people. I'm afraid I don't know offhand the specific situation in Uruguay, but it's a very sensible suggestion. And indeed, one of the things we're working on at the moment is thinking about and looking looking at how to categorize and how to break down young people. We started looking at time use surveys to better categorize young NEETs and to look at actually what they are doing during the day. And this is precisely trying to identify. And a lot of NEETs, we've done this for some South Asian countries, and we find that a lot of NEETs, particularly young female NEETs, are working very hard, much harder than their male counterparts, although they're typically regarded as NEET or outside the labour force. So yeah, this is a really important point, and thanks for raising it. We should be doing this on a more general basis. It's not always that easy to identify, but it's an important point. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much, Niels. So you can actually be a NEET and still work very hard. That's a really important insight. Thank you. I have another question.
Bonjour tout le monde. Merci.
Good morning to all of you. Thank you for having given me the floor. I would like to congratulate the speakers who introduced the subject of NEETs, which will be subject of our discussions during the 2 days. I have one question and two observations. The first observation, I am coming from Mauritania. My name is Bashir, and my first observation is the following. Young people are not born NEETs, they become NEETs afterwards. The challenge is difficult, but we have to struggle against this. But we have also to have better systems of education, training, and these systems should be fair and transparent. The president of WEBS spoke about a second chance, about the learning during the whole life. We can add other concepts to recuperate these needs and to reduce their figures. So for the public service of employment, needs might be a multidimensional problem, but PECs are always considering the fact of finding an employment for these young people. But we are more interested with young qualified needs, and there is not enough communication for these needs. So we have to change a little bit the situation. And now I'm coming to my question. I would like to ask the question to the representative of OECD. You spoke about some publications. Do we have today a guide of your office to see what are the services which can be given to these youngsters? Thank you. So a little bit more information about these publications.
I believe there's a question for you, Karen, to say a little bit more about the services in the public agencies.
So I think, there were a couple observations about more inclusive training and challenges with people that have lower levels of education, but what are the sort of menu of options, I think, is what I was hearing about what can the public employment services do being at the heart, and what are the services that they can offer. So I think some of these are found in different publications at the OECD on different activities for youth at different phases on the sort of spectrum of how they might become a NEET through different circumstances. So we'd be pleased to share with you some of those to help you in your programming.
might I add, just to plug the ILO here, because it so happens that we just produced, in the summer, we published a report on global public employment services, and I think that has quite a lot of information about and also organizational, and so that is one of the publications that's actually listed in the end of my presentation. But yeah, I think we've just produced it. It looks at various aspects, also at more practical aspects of the implementation of public employment services.
Thank you for that recommendation, and thank you for your answer, Karen. We will go to the final question of this. I'm sorry, we will go to the final question, but Niall and Karen will be with us also during the day, so please ask them in person while they're here. But we will go to the final question of this panel, and I'll hand over to you.
Bonjour, je vous remercie pour...
Good morning. I would like to thank you for your marvelous intervention. I'm going to speak about some elements concerning the experience in Mauritania, my country. I'm representing PEC of Mauritania. We have the state in a partnership with the World Bank, which have launched a program who is targeting an important number of youngsters. The agency is doing that from the point of view of orientation, guiding, and besides this training, there are also trainings, professional training and entrepreneurship. The biggest challenge is that these youngsters have a tendency, as it has been said before, to a work of soft skills, let's say. But this phenomenon is rather an urban phenomenon rather than rural in our countries. What are alternatives? Once they choose entrepreneurship or the professional training, a big group of these youngsters will stay in the agencies. So it is another work which agencies and PECs have to realize. The phenomenon in the third world countries is rather an urban problem than a rural one. So how can we train this so important population? And we should go towards them, find an employment and a decent employment.
Karen, you spoke a little bit about as an option for NEETs, so maybe you can say a little bit about that, and then maybe for you, Niels, some more about the difference between the rural and more metropolitan areas. Yeah.
Sure. Well, I think in different contexts, a lot of people are already entrepreneurs in their activities. So as we had a debate earlier about definitions, a lot of people are actually working, but maybe not being classified, as working according to the in employment in a formal sense. I think on the entrepreneurship, so a lot of economies with large informal sectors, people are very entrepreneurial. So they already have a lot of strong skill sets. And then the question is, are they able to generate revenue and have decent working conditions? And what does that mean for the sort of development of a country? So I think there are opportunities to support some of that through collective entrepreneurship as well, through cooperatives, the social economy, to help people maybe in the transition from what might be classified as popular economy or informal economy into something where they get more access to services, training, etc. And on entrepreneurship more generally, I think, the challenges are going to be different in different country contexts in terms of access to finance and skill sets, but there are a lot of programs in the OECD that are giving entrepreneurship training, and it's becoming part of the thinking of curriculum even early in education, so that many people can be equipped with some of the basic skills when you think about entrepreneurship, so that it becomes more readily an option for people because they've had exposure to it throughout their life course. So that's another area, and studies show that the entrepreneurship trainings also can lead to better outcomes in employment integration as well.
Well, I just emphasize that the unemployment rate, the number of young people and others who are unemployed is not a very good indicator in a lot of circumstances, particularly in lower middle income countries. And precisely for that reason, the NEET rate is a better indicator, but it's not the only. I mean, it's good not to forget that 3 out of 4 young people in the world who work are informally employed. So there's also a big issue of job quality. And in low income countries, that's 95% of young people. That's 19 out of every 20 young person has a job, is informally employed. So there are lots of issues of job quality, but building the picture from NEET and looking at different types of NEET can help in building the general understanding of the nature of the youth labour market problem in specific countries. But it's part of a broader, let's say, approach that needs to take these things into consideration.
Thank you, Niall. Well, I don't know how it is about you, but I've learned many things today about NEETs, and we spoke about the difference between being unemployed and being NEET, and how that needs another strategy of activation, and how diverse actually this group is, and how big the differences can be between rural and metropolitan areas. And that if it is not addressed properly, that it will not be resolved, and it could easily scare the individual concerned for many years to come. Luckily, we also spoke about some solutions and that it is possible to address these issues. And I find the solution you spoke about, Karen, about social enterprises and providing opportunities with them very interesting. And also, and we say this more often, how important it is to horizontally cooperate between institutions, preferably in a one-stop shop. Now, there's many things I like about Turkey, but I love their cuisine. And I believe we're going to lunch now, Nicole. We will be back here in 1:30 in this room with colleagues from the Western Balkans, Croatia and Belgium. They will speak about prevention and education for NEETs, to give you some more insights of what you can do in your country. Before we leave, I would like to thank all of you for your active participation and providing us with so many very insightful questions. And of course, I would like a big hand for Karen and Niall. Thank you.